the complicating factor that the law enforcement sources had, they told me, is that, okay, so if you think that the Ramseys did it, right, which one did what?
It is a pickle, no doubt about it.
In episode 2 of the Netflix series, which I have to admit was fairly hard-hitting and a lot more compelling than episode 1, the law enforcement narrative implicating the Ramseys is examined and ridiculed. And unfortunately, that's not hard to do.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I just want to wish you guys a happy Thanksgiving, those tuning in from America. Here's wishing you a warm and fuzzy Thanksgiving from all of us in this community. Now, in this analysis, I want to state the nature of the problem, why Boulder PD and really everyone has struggled to solve this case. And then I want to offer a possible solution to this same problem. How should we be thinking about this?
Worth playing for? Yeah.
Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, thank you to those who did purchase the Day After Christmas series. I see there's a couple of you who did do that. For those interested, the order of the books that I wrote, the chronology, it starts with the CRAVEN Silence series, then the Day After Christmas series, then the Black Star over Bethlehem series, and then its Second Star, and then finally Christmas Star. Christmas Star is my final book in the series. It's also ranked 4.3 out of 5. It's almost got 100 ratings. And that book presents my final analysis thus far on the Ramsey case. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. And in the spirit of Thanksgiving, if you like, you can also punch the thanks button. And let's get started. A. Statement of the problem. Albert Einstein once said, "We cannot solve problems at the same level of thinking that we were at when we created those problems." So let's begin with stating the problem and figuring out the level of thinking we were at the beginning of this case. Our goal is to move beyond that level of thinking to a higher, better, more effective approach to problem solving. Number 1, the one at a time problem.
They felt it was one person who did this.
And typically, if you ask someone their opinion of the Ramsey case, they'll say, I think Patsy did it, I think John did it, I think Berg did it, I think an intruder did it. And all of those scenarios, in my opinion, are very simplistic and very reductionist. It's a lot more complicated than that. But it's also not so complicated that you can't figure it out. In episode 2 of Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey on Netflix, what we see is the same one-by-one approach except via Boulder PD. Boulder PD's finest are taken to task on their respective assessments of the case. It starts with John, Linda Arendt's theory on John Ramsey.
We were being prosecuted in the court of public opinion. And of course, by that time, we were pretty much convicted.
Then we're taken through the theory that Burke did it.
So I put my arm around him and I said, honey, they're all lies. I said, they're ugly, ugly stories. And I said, you just have to pretend like you don't see them.
And then very, very effectively, we're shown why Steve Thomas's hypothesis was full of holes. And it was. And it is.
And you still believe that the garrote would have been placed there by Patsy Ramsey to stage the crime? Is that what your testimony is?
If that's what you're telling me, I won't dispute that's what happened.
Well, do you believe that's what happened?
No, I've offered a hypothesis that I believed was consistent with the evidence as I knew it.
Now, if you're someone at all practiced with statement analysis and you look at the strange contortions of Steve Thomas's mouth here, it really does beg a belief. He looks extremely nervous and he sounds very unconvincing in what he's trying to say.
Possibly what happened.
Now, if it sounds like I'm criticizing the Detective Thomas, I'm not. He was one of the best investigators on the case as far as I'm concerned. And although he ultimately got onto the wrong track, he was on the right track in my view for a good long period. Much of this was due, I think, to what he found out, all of those intricate, intimate, personal dynamics observed by one of the very few people inside the Ramsey house that witnessed them in terms of that privacy of their home. And this was a person that wasn't a Ramsey insider. It was the housekeeper that had seen all the notes that Patsy wrote. I also think Steve Thomas has written one of the best books on the Ramsey case, so if you haven't read it, do yourself a favor. On Netflix, though, a lot of embarrassing footage puts Steve Thomas in not a terribly flattering light, him in particular. We hear from perhaps the Ramsey's greatest asset of all, Lynn Wood. We actually saw him on Dr. Phil as well. And by the way, he's also Dr. Phil's attorney. We hear his disembodied voice asking a clearly rattled Detective Steve Thomas a series of difficult questions about Patsy, which he definitely struggles to answer. I think the reason Linda Arndt, Steve Thomas, and even James Kolar sort of got stuck in their reasoning is they all gravitated to a single perpetrator. All of them thought about the case in a linear fashion, which one person committed this crime, and all of it within a very rigid hierarchy of thinking, which is often typical in hierarchical professions like law enforcement and the military, and even to some extent law, which are governed by stratified codes of conduct and strict protocols. So it may be difficult to set one's thinking free if one has had a lifetime of being tied down to procedural thinking, sort of anchored to a particular way of thinking about things. I'm not saying thinking systematically about the Ramsey case is the problem. It's important that one does that, but one also has to incorporate another kind of thinking. Do you know what that is? Number 2, the fragmentation problem. It is interesting how much time episode 2 focuses on John and Patsy and how little is focused on Burke. The case against Burke is dismissed effectively by Burke's older half-brother rolling his eyes and saying the idea is just crazy.
He could have, killed his sister and delivered this level of violence. I mean, it's just crazy.
Now, arguably about 10 minutes in episode 2 deals with John, about 3 minutes, less than a third as much as they spent on John is spent on Burke, and then roughly another 10 minutes is spent undermining the case against Patsy. Now, it's interesting that they don't deal with any evidence potentially implicating Burke, and there's none. There's the high-tech shoe print in the wine cellar, which is the ground zero of the crime scene. There are the torn gifts in that room where JonBenét lay that were gifts meant to be for Burke, and that it would have been his 10th birthday just a few weeks later in January. When John Andrews says, this level of violence from this little boy is unthinkable, well, he'd apparently hit JonBenét in the face with a golf stick, apparently by accident. By accident or not, that is still something that isn't crazy. It happens quite often with siblings. There's a little bit of violence, I guess, between small children as a matter of course. But John Andrew does have a point. Doesn't this seem like an excessive level of violence? That's a reasonable question, but I don't know if it's a reasonable thing to say, well, it's crazy just to think about it. Bear in mind, there is nothing in this segment about pineapple. Does Pineapple Gate come up a single time in the series? Burke's fingerprints on the pineapple bowl. Does anyone know? Pineapple Gate come up at all? And also nothing about Burke whittling, that's cutting pieces of wood with a knife around the house, or the fact that the only person in the Ramsey family who regularly went down into the basement was Burke. For God's sake, one room in the basement right beside the wine cellar was basically Burke's, the train room. That was Burke's playroom, which is also right beside the window where the intruder supposedly got in. John and Patsy were asked whether they went down to the basement and when last they did. Did anyone ask Burke that? That brings us to B, the solution. Now, in my opinion, the solution to the Ramsey case, certainly part of it, involves a more sophisticated and integrated thought process. If fragmentation is the problem, then integration is the solution. Thinking in an integrated fashion. What does that mean? It means thinking about things in terms of a combination of many different factors, an amalgamation, an integrating of evidence so that it resonates with itself, that it is consolidated, and within that consolidation it makes sense. You merge all of this information, you blend it, you mesh it. It's a assimilation of all the information you have, right? Okay, so how do we do that? Well, number one, through dynamics.
They felt it was one person who did this. It wasn't something like where both parents were involved.
You know, if you say they felt it was one person who did this, is that what the grand jury felt? Didn't the grand jury feel like more than one person was involved? One of the least rigid or procedural things in real life, things beyond a badge or rank or protocols, are family dynamics that wash, that ebb and flow of messy relationships, which evolve, which change over time, you know, between parents and their kids, and between the siblings themselves. This aspect is almost never discussed when we deal with the Ramsey case, other than very superficially, the bedwetting narrative, and the relationships, what were the relationships the Ramseys had with each other. We must also think about dynamics beyond the family unit and look at John's business. There's a whole dynamic around that as well. And did you know that Patsy was very much involved in John's business in the early stages as well? And in an even broader sense, we must understand the dynamics of Boulder as a whole if we are to understand this case. Boulder has a bicycling culture. It also has a chummy legal culture. What impact do these very different things have on the Ramsey case? And these are very real things that are almost never discussed. We must also keep our collective finger on the pulse of the overall evolution of the defense case, rather than just interrogate it or challenge it at any one particular moment in time. That, again, is a fragmented approach. What we want is a holistic approach. Shall I illustrate what I mean with an example? All right, how about the sexual narrative? You may notice the initial Ramsey position during the lead up to the grand jury trial, and when the Ramseys were initially questioned, both by the police and the media in 1997 and 1998 and thereabouts, the Ramseys were always very defensive and very indignant whenever even the suggestion came up that JonBenét's murder also had a sexual element to it. And in this Netflix series, you actually hear and see Dr. Buif also being completely clear that there's absolutely no sexual aspect to the case. Well, then why did something come up in the autopsy?
There have also been innuendos that she has been or was sexually. I can tell you those were the most hurtful innuendos to us as a family. They are totally false.
You don't know how your daughter died?
Well, we do. She was strangled.
That's the cause of death.
That's the cause of death.
But you don't know if any sexual activity took place?
It's not clear to me that there was. We don't know. It's one of those questions you don't want to know the answer to, frankly.
Meanwhile, Patsy said, I believe on Larry King just before what you've just heard, that, and this is in March 2000, that she still hadn't even read the autopsy reports. Do you believe that? Imagine you're on trial for murder in terms of the grand jury, and besides your own connection to the victim, are you going to be completely disinterested in what actually happened? This is going on over years in this crime that you've been implicated in your own house. Is your lawyer who's trying to defend you, you paying to defend you, not going to ask you any questions either? And so I think you have to overlay the timeline of the grand jury trial with the timeline and the evolution of the sexual narrative, and that is how you can understand what is revealed, why, and when it changes. So what do we know about these timelines? Well, the other aspect to note is following their supposed acquittal by the grand jury due to, quote, insufficient evidence, as the DA had it. Well, then suddenly the narrative shifts from hesitation and uncertainty about a sexual element to not only absolute conviction that this was absolutely part and parcel of the crime, but now the minimizing of this aspect flip-flops over to maximizing it. Now the essay is the work of a monstrous pedophile, and the more monstrous the better in terms of the defense case. And today, 28 years later, the pick of the pedophile litter are a slew of sleazy pedophiles. It's quite an arc that the suspect narrative has taken, from the harmless housekeeper and a 70-something Santa Claus in the beginning to the current pedophiles of the moment. Hello, whatever happened to the foreign faction? And Ashley Flowers, in her interview with John Ramsey, brought up a really good point. You know, if you take everything with a foreign faction and it's some kind of vendetta against John, well, how does the sexual element fit into that? And John admits now in 2024, it doesn't make sense. Well, that doesn't help. You've got to make sense of all the information. If you take the intruder theory seriously, and the intruder identifies himself in the ransom note as a foreign faction, the intruder wrote the ransom note, right? Then why is there zero interest in that narrative, in the foreign faction aspect of the narrative? Because in reality, everyone knows it's bogus, including and especially the intruder theory's arch cheerleader, Lou Smith. Was Lou Smith looking for a foreign faction? Anyway, that brings us to number 2, integrating child psychology versus adult psychology into the analysis of this case. What happens when you do that? What happens when you integrate child psychology into your reasoning? Do you need an illustration? I've always found it weird that John Ramsey seems to take real offense when he retells the scenario that JonBenét could have just wandered off. That is what Officer French said when he arrived at the house. And John gets quite upset. No, she didn't just wander off. Interestingly, you see similar indignation in the McCann case and the Nora Corrin case, which played out in the Malaysian jungle. But what would have happened if John had said, well, what if JonBenét did wander off? Let's look for her. That's exactly what would have happened. They would have looked for JonBenét as if she had wandered off. In other words, what if the ransom note isn't relevant? Well, let's call out JonBenét's name, maybe because of who she was. Maybe she was doing something and something happened. Maybe she was playing hide and go seek or riding a bike and fell or tripped or stumbled in the dark. Right? Maybe she was eating a midnight snack. Maybe she's around here somewhere. So if they had searched for JonBenét, a JonBenét that may have wandered off, instead of searching for signs of a kidnapping, they would have found her in the basement within the first 5 to 10 minutes. Think about when Linda Arndt sent John to search the house. How long did it take to find JonBenét? 1 or 2 minutes. JonBenét was real. The kidnapper wasn't. Now, for my money, the mistake virtually everyone has made in examining this case is it ends up being adults looking into the story of a murdered little girl as adults.
Why my eyes, sir? You've never used them before.
No one seems to be able to imagine or remember who JonBenét was, what her world was, who her friends were, what she did for fun, where she went for sleepovers, all the little things that little girls do when they're 6 years old. Instead, what you see is the typical one-dimensional approach to this case, which is echoed in the way we seem to look at all cases and, in a way, how we look at reality. What is shocking? What's sensational? What's black and white? What's absolutely obvious? Do that, my friend, and you're guaranteed to miss the subtleties and the nuance. Family dynamics are nothing if not subtle. Instead, the focus today is on maximizing the crime, making it ultra-violent, the sexual aspect ultra-sexual, and what this does is it basically implicates an adult male. Well done. Well done. Your primitive thinking just keeps snookering you into the same stalemate. This is why our thinking needs to improve. How? How should it improve specifically? Well, in the same way that the ransom note is, I believe, a kind of narrative diversion, it's difficult to avoid imagining that this maximizing of the sexual narrative couldn't be something similar. Because, most people want to imagine a victim close to them that didn't suffer very much. We saw that with Meredith's friends in the Amanda Knox case, who hours after the fact were trying to comfort themselves and saying that they hoped Meredith hadn't suffered too much. You don't see them trying to exaggerate the suffering. So why are we seeing that apparently in this case. Number 3, symbolic framework. There is one area, not only in the Ramsey case, but especially in the Ramsey case, and also typically in all cases where everyone, the cops, lawyers, prosecutors, juries, most of us, the true crime community, are totally naive. And that is the symbolic framework. Ever heard that before? Have you ever heard this topic come up anywhere on any other channel by anyone else? It's actually extremely important, and it's extremely underestimated. It's important because, did you know we human beings are symbolic animals? Our language is a set of symbols. But the way we think and feel and act is also based on unique symbolic frameworks. They're different from one person to another, and also from one culture to another. And this is an incredible way to intuitively solve a case that integrates not only evidence and dynamics, but who a person is within their own symbolic reality. And that is an authentic system you can't fake, you can't hide, and you can't run away from. Well, that's if you're able to discover that or uncover that system as it really was.
If it's so simple, why haven't you done it already?
And yes, this is the tricky aspect to the Ramsey case. You either see cords cruelly and tightly wrapped around JonBenet's wrists, or you see them loosely tied, in almost like a part of a game or something. You see a red heart drawn on the palm of her hand. Did JonBenét draw that for Gary Oliver? I doubt it. What did JonBenét mean by drawing that heart? What was she thinking? What was she feeling? What did it mean to her? See, now suddenly we're in a brand new area. JonBenét's symbolic framework rather than your framework or mine or Detective Steve Thomas's or Linda Arendt's. You need to see this case within the dynamic that brews it, not imposing your own dynamic onto it. And now we have to do something we haven't done before. Work hard to understand a little girl's thoughts, hopes, dreams, and desires. When last did we do that? When last did we try to do that? If you're stuck on the outside, you're in a dimension of stuck thinking. It's all one side, where we could be imagining the flip side of a duality. So you either see a murder weapon in the garrote, or you see a toggle rope. You perhaps see a child's toy that you might find in a scout handbook for small boys. It's one or the other. Which is it? Part of the evidence that doesn't fit an attack by an adult is a piece of fiber that came from the paintbrush found in an intimate area, which suggests a sexually inexperienced and inhibited individual, not some perverted, uninhibited, nefarious monster that is portrayed everywhere, apparently. I do think what you see ends up saying a lot more about you than it does about the case and what actually happened. And this is precisely what exposed the Boulder PD and put them in a bad light. Linda Arndt, I think, was perhaps projecting. Who knows what her relationship was like with her own father? Steve Thomas was perhaps showing signs of transference too. I don't know. But it's not just them. It's us too. It's effectively everyone. We must stop projecting, and instead we must stop thinking through our own filters and think through the intuitive fabric of this whole case, or think through the fabric of this case in an intuitive way that connects and integrates. Does that make sense? And that brings us to the conclusion. We're not done with episode 2, although the episode does tick a few boxes and actually hits the odd home run. It is easy to make fun of the mess-ups in this case. It's easy to mock if you cannot make. And I see a lot of people doing that. If you have a criticism of a particular theory, that's fine. But do you have a theory that can actually stand up to scrutiny? A fragmented approach is all analysis, all undermining. It doesn't really synthesize anything. It doesn't put new information, new thinking, or something that was missing. It doesn't put that in place that somehow brings the rest of the puzzle together. In the next analysis, we'll deal with the stun gun theory, but in the meantime, I want you to think in an integrated way. Put yourself in the shoes of the perpetrator. Ask yourself how the dynamics of the crime itself, when it's actually executed, how does that play out? Where someone is strangled and struck on the head at the same time. I mean, are we dealing with one perpetrator here, or 2? What does the autopsy tell us in this regard? I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.